Gentlemen, hello. My name is Jim Storr. I was a regular army officer in the British Army for 25 years. During that time, I completed what was at the time very rarely an in-service PhD. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I'm going to talk about a case study about actually trying to use HA to affect military practice. I am absolutely convinced of the value of historic analysis for reasons that I'll get to when I conclude. But it doesn't have any real impact unless it changes military practice, and that needs some step which goes through military doctrine. And I did that. Spoiler alert. But it's interesting to see why. In the late 1990s, I worked, first of all, out what was at the time the Defence Evaluation and Research Agency doing high-level OA. I worked on about 15 to 18 projects as a military advisor, and some of those included some work on HA. What occurs to me in now trying to write, moving on to writing doctrine, if we are going to try and work out what to do in future wars, we need to look back at history, but history, it may be our only guide to the events of the future, but it is an imperfect mirror. And for example, is there anyone in here who would call themselves a card-carrying historian? Two of you. Okay, I'm not about to insult historians per se, it's just that you do sometimes miss things. And I've come up with some good examples, but just two taken from 1944-45 Northwest Europe. When you actually look at what happened in Normandy, it seems that Montgomery was trying to do one thing in coming about an encirclement that we now know as the Falaise Pocket. And, come on, sorry, I've lost his name. Bradley? Yeah, Bradley thought he meant something different, and they ended up doing two very different things. And as a result, the Falaise Pocket didn't go as well as it should have done. We can argue about that later, but it doesn't really matter. But historians seem to have largely missed that. And if, for example, you look at the US Army's official history, it points towards that. But most other historians after that have completely missed that point. And another example is what happens after that. The Germans want to try to withdraw to the line of the River Seine. That doesn't work. Patton gets there before them. So they then order the bulk of the German army in the west to withdraw out of France as far as the Vosges and Moselle, out of Belgium as far as I think it's the Albert Canal and Antwerp. No historian that I have ever read, and I've read dozens of books on that campaign, ever mentioned the simple fact that the Germans ordered that withdrawal. So there's big important bits of the history which are actually missing from the record. The other thing is that they sometimes get things wrong. And if you want one really good example, it's about urban operations. The classic historian's view of urban operations is they are horrible, they are bloody, they are revolting, and the attacker takes horrendous casualties. Simply not true. They haven't done their history, and I'll put up a little bit of evidence to support that later. But there is a good reason for that, I think, and several of the presenters earlier today have pointed towards it. Part of the problem is that there is some truth out there, but there's so much noise in the signal that we receive that it's very hard to see what's going on. And what I'd like to do is take a personal example of signal and noise. That won't mean anything to you at all. Forkhill is a very small village on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. I commanded a company there in 1995, and one of the things that we were trying to do was spot where the terrorist suspects were. These were at the time some of the most violent and extreme terrorists in the world. One of them, for example, headed the Provisional IRA. The other one was the head of the PIRA in South Armagh, which is where Forkhill is situated. Early on, we were spotting these guys. This is a 6-month tour of duty, and we were spotting these guys on something like 40 to 60 times during the day. We knew where they were. Someone pointed out, and I think this was a chance remark, was that we never really could say that we knew where they were. We weren't getting enough sightings. And that's the record of the total number of sightings in a given day over the period. What's going on? Well, I think you'd agree, without knowing anything about what's actually we were doing in South Omar, that is very, very noisy data. Now, I'm not really a mathematician. I did do postgraduate maths, but that's not really the point. What I just tried to do was a couple of very simple, let's call them arithmetic techniques, to try and take some of the noise out of the signal. On those days in South Omar, it's due to fog. So if you just take out the days on which there were fog and replace them with the average of the day before and the day after, you get something like that. If you then say, it's still very spiky, it doesn't really give me a trend, what's something like the 3-day rolling average, you get something like that. And the 5-day rolling average is something like that. And I think you'd agree that at that stage, you can see that something's happening, something which has some kind of discernible trend. Well, it goes along the lines of, I was probably the first officer ever to be there, commanding a company, who had actually some formal background in military operations research. I'd done about a month of it in my master's about a year previously, 2 years previously. It goes something like this. About there, I recognized that we had a problem. I then started retraining the troops to be able to do something about it. For various good reasons, it took about maybe a month to do something about it. And by about then, when we were getting about 100 sightings a day, we could say with confidence that we knew where most of the terrorists were most of the time. And that's a bit of a dotted line because it wouldn't say precisely, but it gives you some idea. Where is Sean Hughes? Where is Slab Murphy? We could more or less say that when the sightings were roughly at about that level. On that occasion, I basically had a problem. I had to be casevaced out of theatre. I came back about 10 days later, and in between times, things had gone badly wrong. They had basically forgotten what it was that I wanted them to do. It took me a little while to sort out what was going on, and again, a while to retrain the guy to get back to where we wanted to be. And by about then, we were back to the sort of level we needed to be. So this is about 4.5 months into a 6 months tour of duty. That was a very, very interesting day. The brigade commander came down and he wanted to thank us. He was well aware of the work that the company had done in going from about 60 a day to better than 100 a day. And what he was, and I can tell you the detail later, but he related a story about one of these guys, and he pointed out that my soldiers' sightings in our little bit of Fort Kill contributed to a piece of intelligence of strategic relevance. I'll go into the detail later. It's not really important what it is, but what it was is it told us that when we're up at that sort of levels, we've got things right. What I've just managed to do is relate the fact that there is behind that very, very, very messy signal, should we say, there is some real relevance, there is something going on that we can narrate in ways that we can understand. But I want to swap from there and go on to a big, wide question, which is something that we tried to move into British Army doctrine in about the year 2000. Some guys did some operations research, historical analysis, which says when you look at campaigns as a whole, what is it that points towards one side winning? Almost entirely pragmatic, empirical. No theory behind it, but what are the factors which contribute to winning at the campaign level? And then where we went on from there was, how do we turn that into something that we can put into doctrine and we can train soldiers to do? Many of you will know of David Rowland. He worked for about 30 years for our Postal and Telecoms service. Then in the late 1980s, he moved across to defence. We consider him to be the father of British historical analysis, and I was privileged to work with him on and off during my two-year period. One of the most interesting papers he produced was really quite early. It looked back into field trials from elsewhere. And you may say, well, what's all that about? Combat degradation. key thing there was a very simple graph that he put up. He and his team looked at all of the urban operations that they could get good casualty data from, 28 of them, all taken pretty well from the Second World War, but including, how do you pronounce it, Hue in Vietnam and so on and so forth. And he found that in not a single one of them did the attackers' casualties exceed the defenders. Not a single one. Now, as I've remarked elsewhere, we have known that for something like 30 years, but it is probable that no historian has ever read that journal. So they do get things wrong. We can do better as a community, but it's important to get that kind of information and get it across to practitioners. Really, what's more important for this particular piece of work are those two. Lightly classified, I think they were classified as restricted, about a year apart, but they answered that question, or rather they addressed that question about what wins, and that's of the two papers, that's the more important one. What Roland and his colleagues did was they said to a bunch of historians, please look at as many campaigns as you can across quite a long period and tell us which factors you think were important. And they came up with an initial let's look for list of about 50 possible factors, and I'll put some of them up in a moment. And then they rapidly realized that actually a goodly number of them had no real significant effect. So they reduced the number to 12, which they subsequently went back up to about 16. And they said, okay, historians, did that factor appear in that campaign? Yes or no, tick. Across a total of 168 land campaigns. Now, 168 goes right back to and includes the American Civil War, which is very useful in historical terms, because that's before mass use of machine guns and before motorization and mechanization. It goes to the Boer War, where you're starting to get more modern technologies, and it goes through the First, Second World Wars and right up to, I think, 1973. In other words, all of the land campaigns that you could get good data for. It was then published in an open source journal, that one, about 4 years afterwards. And it was just after that, 98, 99, that I had the privilege of working with Roland and Spate and Keyes, who were the other two there, for example. I didn't work with them very often, but I did work face-to-face with David Rowlands on a couple of occasions. These are the sorts of things that they put up as being the sort of factors that you would expect would have some outcome. So, for example, if one side had superior intelligence, did that correlate with campaign success? If another side opened or made major use of night attacks, did that or did that not have major impact on campaign success? They thought they had some idea of the answers, but they were very, very surprised. We've been talking about that one. We've been talking about that one ad nauseum. Well, actually, not very important, and that did surprise them. The ones that came up tick, 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 time and time and time again, very closely correlated with success, were effectively those. That needs a little bit of explanation, which I'll come on to in a moment. In the 2 years that I was at the high-level studies department, I looked through those papers again. I went and spoke to David Rowlands. We did a couple of small studies together, but more to the point, by the end of 2 years there, I had stuff which, when I moved to my next post, which was writing high-level army doctrine, we could exploit. It was about that time that I was doing my doctorate. The external examiner for my doctorate was a brigadier. It turns out he was about to be my boss. The day that I did my Viva exam, we sat down in the officers' mess bar that night, and he congratulated me, and he said, right, you're now moving from the command development branch to the doctrine branch, and you're going to start writing or rewriting land force doctrine. By way of exploration, as I say, I discussed the issues with David, and going back to another question earlier about multidisciplinary teams. For one small project which we did, which was entitled The Attack on Will at Low Level, The three key protagonists were myself, the military advisor, David Rowlands, the guy with his fingertips on all of the historical analysis, and a card-carrying psychologist. In other words, getting into the actual behavior underpinning what happens in these things. So, for example, why does surprise work? How does it work? What are the implications of those things which correlate at the campaign level in terms of tactics, perhaps at the section platoon level, but more to the point at the formation level? And so how should we rewrite doctrine to get people to do those things? Now, this is a bit of historical use. I literally took the next 3 slides from the PowerPoint that I was using at the time. So where you see that inverted comma up there, that is one of the original slides. I haven't changed those at all. Those factors correlate very, very strongly. What I've done there is amalgamate surprise as being initial surprise on day 1 of the campaign and multiple surprise, meaning surprise repeatedly through the execution of a given campaign. Some of these factors come up as being incredibly important. The numbers come to something like, in some circumstances, surprise can have the same effect as a force multiplier of 200 to 1. You'll say that's rubbish, which is quite right, because you never get a force ratio of anything like 200 to 1, but if you extrapolate the graphs, that's the sort of impact you can get. Again, one of my original slides, and I used to brief these on what we call the battle group command